Right, hello family and friends, welcome back. Sorry, but we're gonna have to take another detour. As I said, I'm looking to wind this thing down and I really don't know how to end, but I just wanted to go into other things. Which I think are kind of important. Like I said, I have so much planned and I have to all kind of condense it down. Even doing Jeremiah, I'm not going to read everything that was planned. I'm going to just have to try and condense because my last videos, these are going to be my last videos for now anyway, and it's tough to decide what to read, what to say. Anyway, I wanted to go into other things and I've just totally forgotten what I was going to say, but let's just get started anyway. It will come back to me. So we're going to go into England's Other Countrymen. Because it's very interesting. I always said I wanted to read stuff like this to you because it's super interesting, but it's proper wordy, man. It's really wordy. And basically, I get it. Like, this guy who's very educated, and he probably wrote this book. He didn't write this book for us. He wrote this book to probably challenge preconceptions of his peers and whatever. But it's really frustrating. I mean, it's educating, knowing these words and stuff, finding out. But can you really use them? Can you really use these words when talking to the average man like me or you? You can't really use these words. You just sound all pompous and you're just using them to sound really educated when nobody really knows what you're talking about, and you just have to explain. What's the point in using these words if you have to explain them? It's just a bit frustrating. But you're gonna have to bear with me. It's a difficult read because it's got, like, some of it has taken notes and sections of people's documents. It's the old way of speaking, the old way of writing even. You know, in like the old way of writing, an S looks like an F. Just stuff like that. It's so tough, man. But anyway, this is really important. It's really thought-provoking and challenging. So enough. Let me just get into it. For people in early modern England to believe that Noah's curse had any validity. So basically, I'm into a chapter called Painting the Blackamoor Black. And it starts off, well, the previous chapter is the pathology of the curse of Ham, and it goes all the way through the curse of Ham and everything. Now, I'm not reading this for the biblical details and facts. I'm reading this, it's about hearts and minds. Hearts and minds. So don't pay too much close attention on the details, family. But more about the attitudes, because there's a lot of this book is basically critical race theory 500 years ago. It's really interesting. People in early modern England to believe that Noah's curse had any validity at all. A theological case had to be made to prove that the subject of the curse was sinful enough to deserve it. In this case, it was problematic because Ham's children were not protagonists in the story, and the God of Abraham had already blessed them for saving the fauna of the earth. This may have been why interpolations were created, because plain readings of the Bible did not provide adequate justifications for punishing Ham and his children. As described in the last chapter, outlandish interpolations were imagined, and we now know some of the interpolations drew inspirations from paganism and classical Greek fables, and not from the Bible. These interpolations fabricated sins that Ham, Canaan, or Cush committed to make their punishments more deserved. This is why Ham and his children became the princes of Afrique, that delved into evil magic, as in the stories of Clement of Rome. Some of Clement's stories were translated and read in early modern England. He claimed that Ham had handed down the instruction of the evil magic to one of his sons, who was called Mizraim, from whom the race of the Egyptians, Babylonians, and Persians were descended. Other writers stated that Ham had done more to Noah than uncover him. Jean de Cardignan stated this in his 15th century work translated by the Englishman William Goodyear. Cartignan wrote that through the magical arts Ham disclosed his father's private parts. He presumed to touch his secret parts and enchanted them by his magical art. He, Noah, could not joy issue with any women to beget children. These stories were created not just to delegitimize Ham or his children, but to theologically legitimize Noah. Other interpolations had Ham or his sons castrate his father and or be engaged in homosexual acts with him, with the word uncover being a euphemism for those acts. The implication of some of these interpolations was that Ham, through an incestuous union with his own mother, had fathered Canaan, Mizraim, and Cush. In this, Ham and his children were ill-fated and doomed anti-heroes, as in the classical legends, and therefore, by default, Noah's curse was vindicated. We now know this is needed to legitimize Noah's cursing was also why some writers conflated it with Mark of Cain. This provided a theological validation for Noah's curse, which could then be said to come directly from God. Christian writers such as Ambrosiaster, 4th century, and Hieronymus Augustodonius, 12th century, wrote these kind of interpolations. This idea was also pursued by English writers in the early modern period, such as the popular female author Juliana Berners. In the book of St. Albans, published in 1486, Berners was the female prioress of St. Albans, and her book was widely read and republished throughout the 16th and 17th centuries by authors such as Gervase Markham. Berners stated that Ham's descendants lived in the land of Canaan, and then, by default, the mark of Cain fell onto them too. This meant Ham's descendants were twice cursed. However, Berners did not state that Africans were the recipients of this double curse. In fact, she stated something else far more interesting. Europe is a country of churls. Berners' book did not label Africans in any negative way. Her work stated that English people were children of Ham. Despite Berners' popularity, the implication of this idea for early modern thought is rarely discussed by modern historians, especially as Berners described the Hamitic lineage as a heritage that many European nobles aspired to be a part of. And she stated that either they shared an ancestry with Africans or it was their sole inheritance. It is a startling revelation that some English nobility in modern England wanted Ham and African kings to be their ancestors. It is equally startling that they believed that this lineage would legitimize their authority among other European powers. Moreover, some early modern writers advocated that Ham was the ancestor not only of English nobility but of all Europeans. The English writer Giles Godot, 1560, asserted this in his A Brief Abstract of the Genealogy of Late Kings of England, 1560 to 1562. These notions meant that the European with the purest Hamitic lineage was the one most entitled to rule. This was despite the apparent churlishness, commonness, or vulgarity of Ham. Berners had this to say: how Englishmen first began, how gentlemen first began, and how Noah divided all the world. Ham, the churl, was given Europe. Japheth, the noble, the Occident, Asia, and was the ancestor of Abraham. And Shem, also a gentleman, shall take the other third part of the world, which shall be called Africa. Europe is the country of churls, the Occident country of gentlemen. Africa is the country of temperance. Berners comments on Europeans being churls and the inheritors of Ham's ungentleness was an idea reiterated throughout the later editions of her book. Berners later emphasized the churlishness of Europeans by disenfranchising them from Europe altogether. She wrote, "Shem, my son, I make thee a gentleman, also to multiply the blood of Abel to thee. I give the Orient, that part of the world which be called Asia, which is the country of Africa, which is the country of temperance. Seth was given Asia, but Ham and his descendants remain landless, vagabonds, runagates, without a homeland." Berners revealed a human hierarchy, one that placed white people at the bottom. White people were a rootless and wandering race, but as we discover, some Europeans were willing to tolerate this inscription of inferiority because it served another purpose. As intriguing as Berners' comments were, she was not the first European to claim that Englishmen were vagabond children of Ham. The Welsh cleric and historiographer Geoffrey of Monmouth, 12th century, also did. He mythologized an English history that stated the kings of Wales and England owed their origins to a person called Brutus. He was a mythical ruler of ancient Britannia and a direct descendant of Ham. This Brutus was also purported to be a descendant of Osiris, the Egyptian king and king in Egypt. Tudor kings, anxious to prove their legitimacy, claimed this lineage. The Welsh writer Arthur Kelton articulated these apologues in 1547. Apologues. As did William Harrison and his accounts of the giants of Albion being the first people in England. Albion the giant repaired hither with his own race proceeding from Ham to miserable servitude, the most extreme thraldom. Henry VIII embraced aspects of this of these legends and presented himself as a descendant of Ham. He commissioned pictures of his ancestor Ham in books that he sponsored. These images resembled those found in Martin Luther's Deutsche Catechisms, printed and available in England. From 1531, Henry transformed the piety of his father's courtage and embraced his ancestor with a pseudo-Epicurean panache. Henry became a bearded master of ceremonies that presided over a court of corpulence and greed. To be godlike was to be like Ham, the trickster, womanizer, drunkard, and glutton. Doesn't that sound like celebrities today? And the odd politician now and then when they get caught. Ham became Henry's legitimizer because the English king was the son of a usurper. Other English nobles had a more direct claim to the English throne, so Henry claimed mythical ancestors, such as Ham, to bolster his royal pedigree. Henry employed scholars and writers to confirm his credentials. See how easy it can be done by someone high up. Employed scholars and writers to confirm his credentials. These apologues amounted to propaganda, but formed part of the works of early modern thought. Godot declared that the English and Welsh were children of classical figures such as Hercules, the kings of Troy, and ancient Cometian kings. Under Elizabeth I, other Englishmen wrote about how Ham's descendants arrived in England, such as Richard Lynch in his popular 1602 treatise, Travels of Noah into Europe. Lynch stated, as other English writers had done before, that Ham's lineage was infused with great vitality and that his trickery emulated Bacchus, Dionysus, and Pan, who spent much of their time in self-ingratiating hilarity. In 1604, the Welsh writer George Owen Harris proclaimed the same idea when he wrote that James I was the fulfillment of a heritage populated with African gods and Greek heroes. So these are some of the reasons why Ham and his lineage were desirable to some English, Welsh, and Scottish nobility. Ham's trickery became an asset, and his schemes and realization of his vitality. He was the mightiest and noblest of his brethren. However, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, and James I were not the only monarchs in Europe to claim to be children of Ham. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Europe, he purported to have such lineage, as did several popes and kings of France. The writings of Hieronymus, Gebweiler, and the Annian genealogy attest to that. And this lineage was embraced by nobles across Europe. So you see, people make all these claims, but there's no scriptural facts in here. There's no proper real understanding of the whole book. And you can see little clues in here. Little clues how all the nobles are claiming to be of Ham and of people of the Bible. And that they know, they claim, or they know that they have African lineage, heritage. So me reading this, you can see the clues, and it's something. There's huge chunks missing here, which we kind of know today, which a lot of people don't want to admit, but hiding something, but also the false claims and admitting certain things as well. So there's been a lot of confusion and like missing things here and there. Each one wanted to be the King of Kings and used whatever mechanism they felt could work. This may be why popular images of Ham showed him and his descendants as white in the Matthew's Bible. So when Best and Hamner claimed that Africans were cursed children of Ham, they were actually opposing a strong and very well established European tradition that claimed the Hamitic lineage as a European heritage. This provided an obvious and powerful reason why there would be theological, political, and intellectual resistance to interpolations such as those quoted by Best and Hamner. So now everybody's arguing about it. There are people who know this, and they know that, and there are people who want to claim this and claim that. But in claiming this, they're kind of not admitting. So in claiming to be descendants of Ham, they're claiming that they're cursed, but they're saying the curse is a good thing because it's a trickster, a womanizer, a drunkard, and a glutton, and has wits, and they're claiming it to be a good thing, whereas other people wanted to make it a bad thing because, as I read in the previous page, it talked about homosexuality and incest. Different people were like just making too much out of the scriptures, basically reading too much into things and just running away with theories of clever men and philosophers and priests, and just running away with things. Hey, that sounds good to me, I'll take it, I'll run with it. Sins, folk devils, and Ham's children. Interpolations, extrapolations, and apologues about the curse of Ham were attached to what was an already popular story. This meant that an early modern understanding of the story was not the same as we have now. The story of Noah remained popular with ordinary people in all three of the Abrahamic religions, but not because it was about the ethnology of Africans, or even because it answered a desire among European nobles for classical ancestry. Rather, the story of Noah was popular with everyday people because it provided lessons of obedience for children. For many, it was a temperament and sin, not skin color, that indicated you were the son of Ham. This law resounds in the work of some classical writers and early church authors, such as Ambrosiaster, whose writings were translated and available in England. A 1516 version of his work stated servitude, moreover, comes from such sin. Your deeds determined whether you were spiritually or metaphorically a child of Ham. Henry VIII alluded to this as a truism in his personal correspondence of Catherine of Aragon in 1532. In the preface, with his hand-written note, Henry stated, "No one should be a slave or bound to Christ. Christ is freedom. Jesus is the very freedom, a noble liberty of the spirit. Sin is bondage and liberty of conscience." This may seem ironic, bearing in mind his desire to be part of the Hamitic lineage. But Henry was echoing early modern preoccupation with Christ freeing man from iniquity, as stated by Martin Luther in his Deutsche Catechism. Noah's son Ham was the first to merit receiving the title slave. Slavery has its origin in sin, and slavery was God's punishment for sin. We should acknowledge that the theological preoccupation with sin in the Noah story was more important than issues related to ethnology. Theologists in earlier modern England were obsessed by how even a good man such as Noah and his children could fall from grace, as it revealed the fragility of man. English writers such as Gervase Babington, 1550 to 1610, concurred that their ideas were echoed in the works of the influential Dutch humanist Desiderius Erasmus, that sin and slavery could be absolved once one accepted Christ. Others, such as Ambrose of Milan, a mentor of St. Augustine of Hippo, repeated this notion: for those who be true and trust in Christ, they are free, just as Noah's son Ham's sinfulness and imprudent behavior was the curse of servitude. Only Christ of the New Testament could redeem mankind. English theologians could therefore label Ham and his descendants as the epitome of wickedness, folk devils, and the nemesis of mankind. Through political expediency, political opponents could also become children of Ham, steeped in infamy. For example, during the English Civil War, royalists argued that the killers of King Charles I were children of Ham and Cain. They also stated that Cain's bloody race, known by their fruits, had maligned the innocent and were against the servants of the living God. These English writers claim that the sufferings of the servants of the Lord in Chester City during the Civil War were caused by those with Cain's mark. Moreover, that King Charles I was able, the sacred majesty of the king, the sacred majesty of the king, of happy memory. Evidence of the mark curse was not in the perpetrator having a different skin complexion. Some affix this mark into Cain's whole body. Others confined it only to some particular part and member thereof. Those who bore this mark to consist on a paralytical, fearful trembling of all his joints, heads, hands, and the whole body, or marked with a stigmata on the forehead. This is just nuts. It's just nuts. So to claim that your enemies were marked by Cain or cursed by Noah could be a useful ploy in sanctifying your cause against them. You see that stuff like that caught on. The church used it to justify slavery. And you can see that, like, in these times, it was being done. It was being done against just your opponent, like political opponents. It appears for some people in early modern England, Ham's descendants could be anyone you choose to label as such. Nevertheless, some Europeans claimed a Hamitic lineage because they wanted to be associated with what they regarded as spiritual power and the mighty empires of Ham's descendants. Other Englishmen were willing to call other Englishmen sons of Ham because they denatured them as spiritually wicked. There was not a coherent ethnological or racial agenda, but a spiritual, flexible one. This was illustrated by the beliefs of another set of early modern English writers, suggests that the curse of Ham was specific to one person, Canaan. These authors included Englishmen such as John Bale in Illustrium Maioris Britanniae Scriptorum, 1548. The Bishop of London, Edmund Bonner, 1555, and the French-German theologian Wolfgang Masculus, in his Moses Genissim Plenissimi Commentari, 1565, Masculus wrote, "But he, Noah, did not say, 'Cursed be Cush,' or 'Cursed be Mizraim,' or curse be put, but curse be Canaan. We can see that many English people had different understanding about how the curse of Ham than we about the curse of Ham than we may assume. There were also Englishmen that were willing to refute the interpolations repeated by Best and Hamner. These Englishmen's connections to Africans in early modern England may have influenced their perspectives. Thomas More's Black. Thomas More was one of early modern writers that openly questioned interpolations of the blackness of Africans, the result of a myth or curse. More was a social philosopher, politician and thinker, and the personal advisor to Henry VIII. He was Lord High Chancellor from 1529 to 1535. He was widely regarded throughout Europe, and as an important and influential thinker, his books, which included Utopia, are still popular today. More was also a leading Renaissance humanist and part of a small group of elite intellectuals respected for their knowledge of the classics. More's written books were widely available. However, few historians have commented on his writings in the first book, written in 1528, published 1557, where he talked about ethnology. The first book preceded Holinshed's Chronicles and was concerned with many matters including history, religion and culture. For example, on religion, More stated how necromancers, animists, put faith in their circles, and in a similar way to the French philosopher Jean Bodin, 1530-1596, he claimed the similarities that existed between different religions. In the midst of these inquiries, More asked, "What maketh black and white men?" He then attempted to answer that question and make sense of how Africans saw their blackness through their own eyes. In this way, More may have been persuaded by the views and opinions of Africans that lived in Tudor England. More's comments are also very important, and he was a politician at the centre of English statecraft. His views may therefore offer an insight to how those in power saw ethnology. More wrote, "If there were a man of Indy that never that never came out of his country, nor had seen any white man or woman in his life, aside being be seeneth innumerable people black, he might well think that it were against the nature of a man to be white. Now if it that because nature seemeth to see him to behave, therefore that all the world eyed, if they would say the contrary, that all men should be black. But if he believed for against reason and against nature, but he had no reason to accept this, except he is not white." Irregular spellings have been retained in this quotation. At the bottom, right there. People used to spell different in these days. So it's hard to read. More used the word Indie to describe black people. This term was significantly wide to indicate Africans as well as other people of colour. More attempted to explain not only the origin of blackness but also whiteness. In so doing, he did something quite remarkable. He articulated an early modern black perspective on whiteness and used it to illustrate the fallacy of mysticizing skin colour. His man of India became a translator that more used to reveal that ethnology was socially constructed. We tend to think of this way of seeing ethnology as the result of an enlightened modern perspective, and we may consider that such reflections by a white Englishman in early modern England were impossible, but we would be wrong. More used the indie black man to question, rationalize, and normalize blackness and whiteness. And by taking the black man's perspective, he also proposed that if black people had grown up in a country black, whiteness could seem against nature. More proposed that how we see ethnic differences is all culturally relative. He later commented, whereas ye say if the man of India had learning learning the so perceive that it is not against nature but rather consonant with nature, that some other men should in other countries be white, though all his countrymen were black. Sorry if that didn't make sense, but crikey. These sorts of statements did not just constitute a defense of blackness, but stood against anyone being othered because of their color. However, a modern reader may dismiss this perspective as evidence of fantastic imagination, perhaps as fantastic as interpolations of the Curse of Ham. However, we now know that Africans and other people of color lived in Tudor England, and that a more moved in social circles where they lived. Furthermore, we know that Africans worked and stayed in households where more stayed. His comments then provide a reflection of early modern black thought. So this guy actually lived among black people. He met black people. He spoke to them. He wasn't just writing, just trying to be clever and just write whatever he thinks and just sound, or just read somebody else's stuff and just run with it. This guy actually asked the questions. He went to the people. He lived among the people. He met them. As the historian David Northrop argued, in the early modern period, Africans were fully capable of interpreting their own colour without a negative inscription. And it should be added, provide definitive interpretations of their ethnology. Moore affirmed this with the phrase that all men should be black, a phrase which seemed to reflect the adage that blackness was the de facto colour of humanity. This adage was a classical theory espoused by African theologians such as Origen of Alexandria, Origen Adamantus. Origen proposed that the original man was black. He also stated in the Homilies of Origen 184 to 253 CE, which consolidated concepts already present in Alexandrian society, that blackness presented the primal image of God. Excuse me, sorry. It is likely that Moore had read such classic ideas. But what was more intriguing was the notion that the Africans Moore met in England had these views on colour, and that this influenced what he wrote. Moore stated, and he might by nature perceive, if he had learning, why the heat maketh his country black, and of like reason why cold of other countries must make their people white. Moore stated that the heat makes people black by default. Here, thereafter, distanced himself from the magical origins of heliotropic blackness or astronomy. Moore also set aside interpolations of the curse of Ham as a cause of blackness, and regarded the idea of the curse as strange. Moore stated, without miracles, we may only believe in what we can see or prove. In addition, Moore wrote, the cause of his blackness, but if it be by astronomy, which conning, who can learn that nothing will believe. Moore seemed to have interpreted the types of fables associated with the interpolations as conning. A con was often conceived for an ulterior motive related to financial exploitation. Perhaps Moore implied that those who promoted magic and mysticism to decipher natural phenomena were doing so for cynical, pecuniary reasons. We have seen how this may have been the case with Best and Hamner. Moore's comments confirm that some early modern Englishmen were capable of contextualizing the question of complexion with social relativism. We have further indications that early modern English society was not automatically anti-African. We explore this as we examine the writing of another early modern writer, Francis Bacon, touching the coloration of black and tawny Moors. Francis Bacon in 1620 wrote comments on the complexion of Africans that in some ways were similar to those made by Moore. Bacon's treatise in Novum Organum was called Experiment Solitary touching the coloration of black and tawny Moors. Bacon was a powerful and important man in early modern England. He was a philosopher and author, as well as being the legal advisor to Elizabeth I, the Attorney General and the Lord Chancellor of England. He was often regarded by many intellectuals as the architect of the Bacon method. He advocated a methodology of experimentation over faith and mysticism. Bacon wrote, the heat of the sun maketh men black in some countries, as in Ethiopia and Guinea, etc. Fire doth it not, as we see in glassmen that are continually about the fire. The reason may be because fire doth lick up the spirits of the blood of the body, so as they exhale, so that I ever maketh men look pale and sallow. But the sun, which is a greater heat, doth but draw the blood to the outward parts, and rather concocteth it than soaketh it. And therefore we see that all Ethiops are fleshly and plump, and have great lips, all which betoken moisture retained and not drawn out. We also see that the Negroes are bred in countries that have plenty of water by rivers or otherwise. The Meroe, which was the metropolis of Ethiopia, was upon a great lake, and the Congo, where the Negroes are, is full of rivers, and the confines of the river Niger, where Negroes also are well watered, and the region above Cape Verde is likewise moist, insomuch as it is pestilent through moisture. But the countries of the Abyssinies and Barbary and Peru, where they are tawny and olivaster and pale, are generally more sandy and dry. Bacon never travelled to the continent of Africa, but he had visited countries throughout Europe and was familiar with English colonies in the Americas. Therefore, as with Moore, the Africans that Bacon met or saw were those outside of Africa. It is also likely that, as with Best, he was writing about Africans present in early modern England and was then extrapolating his theories on blackness and Africa from these interactions. Nevertheless, Bacon spoke about Ethiopia and Guinea as though he knew them, but his opening remarks show that he did not. He was ignorant of a global African presence and other people of colour that lived throughout the world. This seems to indicate that the Africans Bacon had met in England were those from specific places: Ethiopia, Congo, and areas surrounding the Niger River and Cape Verde. Evidence in Blackamoor's proved that Africans from these places lived in Tudor and early Stuart England. Moreover, this presence included intellectuals, navigators, and literate members of ruling families that were capable of articulating their perspectives on their own origins, identity, and ethnicity. Bacon attempted to examine the issue of the complexion. Bacon attempted to examine the issue of the complexion of Africans using methodology of experimentation. He began with what he believed to be the most logical hypothesis, not one based on mysticism or curses, but observations of natural phenomena, climate, and heat. It was likely for these reasons that Bacon, as with Moore, did not explicitly quote interpolations of the Curse of Ham because he felt they lacked credibility. In a similar way to Moore, Bacon's rationalism was based on exploring, discovering, and investigating not only ancient text, but established religious doctrine. Bacon then rationalized his hypothesis by what he had observed: that Africans were fleshly, plump in in other words, when compared to white people. In this way, Bacon's perspective lacked the relativism of Moore that deconstructed the socially created normative of whiteness and reflected on ethnology using a black perspective. Instead, here, Bacon worked from a white normative. Nevertheless, in making such a vivid observational comment, Bacon seemed to be talking about Africans with whom he was familiar. Other comments he made on people from the Abyssinians, Barbary, and Peru would have been supported by stories from English and foreign travellers present in England. The people of colour from these regions, Bacon suggested, were tawny, meaning lighter in complexion than black. But what Bacon appeared not to know was that even in the same family, complexion and hair texture may vary. You can have the same mum, same dad, and you can have a brother and sister that's lighter than you, may have softer hair than you. That's what's happened over the centuries, throughout the occupations, throughout the captivities, throughout the invasions. The Romans, the Greeks, Babylonians. And it changes all the time. Like I said before, other races have appeared from occupations and invasions, and even now, even today, new people are springing up from all the immigrations. There's quite a lot of black people moving to Japan. There's Africans in China now. You think the longer they stay, 50 years, more normal it comes, and then people start to have interracial relationships, and then you'll get the mixed black and Asian. Where was I? people of colour and complexion than black. But what Bacon appears to know is even in the same family, complexion and hair texture may vary, and that in all the regions just mentioned, there were and are people that may be referred to as black who had 9 ether hair, different shades and types of black people. These African people were also to be found in more sandy and dry places in North Africa, Arabia, and elsewhere. Bacon constructed a truism that he promoted as being based on empiricism, but it was in fact limited by lack of knowledge and anthropology and geology. We may see in a similar way Bacon's comments on water and heat creating blackness, as if being black was an alchemical reaction to the elements in his last comments. As for the Ethiops, as they are plump and fleshy, so it may be that they are sanguine and ruddy coloured. If their black skin would suffer it to be seen. Bacon noted that African people may be plump and fleshly in outer appearance, but could still be sanguine and ruddy coloured inside. The black skin covered their true colour. Of course, this last statement contradicted everything that he said before, but it may be a kind of affected way of saying that colour is only skin deep. Bacon's words in Novum Organum was part of a wider philosophy of Renaissance humanism that was echoed in the reasoning and philosophy of writers such as Erasmus and Roger Bacon, the 13th century philosopher, as well as the 14th century English writer William of Ockham. Ockham was important because his device of investigation, known as the Occam's razor, was widely used by philosophers and writers of the time. This approach was to analyze competing arguments and theories using logic, with the theory that had the fewest assumptions being the most likely. Returning to Francis Bacon, he wrote, "And the human understanding is like a false mirror, which, receiving rays, irregularly distorts and discolors the nature of things by mingling its own nature with it." Bacon believed in distinguishing or cutting away the false distortion to distinguish fact from fiction. A similar perspective was also reflected in the writings of the Frenchman Joseph Justus Scaliger, 1540 to 1609. He was critical of Annius's interpolations, although he did use the Annian genealogy. Bacon may have read Scaliger and used it to set aside interpolations connected to curse of Ham. Bacon was critical of myths that claimed the complexion of Africans was caused by fire or magic, but in suggesting that heat as a cause, he showed his belief in the theory of the four humours, where the humour of the person revealed how a person could be healed. And in his essays or counsels, civil and moral, of Francis Bacon, The Wisdom of the Ancients, he proposed, in the warmer climate the people are generally more wise, but in the northern climate the wits are chiefly greater. Bacon's notions were consistent with the concept that a person's humour provided an indication of their intelligence, but his notions were far from any fixed concept of biological determinism of Africans' inferiority. In fact, the implication from Bacon's comments was that Africans were wiser because they came from a warmer climate, Moreover, Bacon could contextualize these comments using classical writers such as Aristotle, who stated, "If therefore some men differed from others as much as we think, gods and heroes are different from men, having simply great superiority, first of body and then of soul, so that the superiority of the rulers in aspect of their subjects were undoubted and manifest, it is clear that it would be better for those to rule always for life." If therefore some men different from others as much as we think, gods and heroes differ from men, having simply great superiority, first in body, then of soul, so that the superiority of the rulers in respect of their subjects were undoubted and manifest, it is clear that it would be better for those men to rule always. See, it's dangerous for people to just run with these things, And you can see the effects of it today because we live in this side of the world. We're only hearing one side of the story, and we've only got one, and history is written from certain people, and people take that aspect because it sounds good, it sounds great, it makes them look good, it makes them look superior, it makes them look smarter, when it's not actually the truth. You're hearing their story, the way they see themselves. And it's dangerous. It's very dangerous. And as I keep reading this book, as I keep reading more, you're going to find out how people thought so differently and they knew certain stuff. And then you're going to think, okay, so what actually happened? By asserting these sorts of ideas, early modernists such as Bacon could suggest that people were not inherently superior to others. It was a controversial sentiment, not necessarily because of ethnology, but in trajectory, since it questioned the divine right of kings. Obviously, Greek writers such as Aristotle could have their writings used to justify many different theories, and this does not mean that early modernists such as Bacon were immune from repeating classical myths. For example, he quoted from Aristotle in Wisdom of the Ancients, "Wherefore doth the imagination of the mother, which imagineth of an Ethiopian or blackamoor, cause the mother to bring forth a black child, as Albertus Magnus reporteth of a queen who in the act of carnal copulation imagined of a blackamoor, which was painted before her, and so brought forth a blackamoor. And so in this purpose the imagination is about the forming power. And so the child born followeth the imagination, and not the power of forming and shaping." See, that's just nuts. So the woman, while she's having sex, basically, she's looking at a painting of a blackamoor on the wall, or imagining a certain thing, and there she brought forth a black child. And that's just, it just doesn't make sense. But this is a long time ago. Like, see, people had their imaginations and their theories just ran away with them. They were wild with them. But what I got from that statement there is that, look, where doth the imagination of the mother which imagineth of an Ethiopian or a blackamoor cause the mother to bring forth a black child? As Albertus Magnus reporteth of a queen who in the act of carnal copulation imagined of a blackamoor which was painted before her. See what I mean about little clues there? So on her wall is a painting of a blackamoor, or as they said in that day, an Ethiopian. Where are these paintings? What happened to them? Why are there paintings of black people on the walls in these times? If we were just slaves, or we were just half naked Africans swinging from trees at this time. uh, These same sorts of fantasies were also written about classical authors such as the ancient Greek writer Heliodorus. It was translated by Thomas Underdown and called An Ethiopian History, 1569. That the earnest imagination of a woman going great causeth often the child to be born with the qualities and conditions of the thing imagined. And in Plutarch, that a white woman conceiving child by a white man was deluded of an infant coal black, because at the time that she conceived, she held her eyes and imagination fixed upon the picture of a blackamoor, which was painted in a cloth upon the wall, which the child wholly resembled. That proceedeth of the imagination of the mother, which thinketh of the disposition of the father in the act of carnal copulation, and therefore by reason of the strong imagination in the time of conception, the children get the disposition of the father, as it appeareth before the queen, which had her imagination on a blackamoor, and of an Ethiopian queen, which brought forth a white child, because of her imagination was upon a white colour. These same sorts of fantasies were also written about by the hugely influential and important early Christian father, the Romanized African Saint Augustine of Hippo, 4th and 5th century CE, in his book City of God, and it was discussed in Blackamoors. In this story, the principal white character attempts to prove, despite her whiteness, that she is part of an Ethiopian royal family. As the historian Suyata Yengar states, in this legend, the aristocracy is black, and it is the white body which shows up as a parent, cast out and ultimately subjected through battery and enslavement to control. Whiteness was othered by this classical fable. Bacon quoted such fables, but he distanced himself from advocating them and concentrated on what he thought he could prove, which was that it was heat and water that made the complexion of Africans, not the dreams of the mother or the imagination of God's fires from a sun god or curses of Ham. His observations of Africans present in the diaspora are likely to have informed his decision making. So here you go, 500 years ago, critical race theory. And it just makes you think, what happened? Like, what happened? You know, would we be where we were today if things didn't change like that and all this stuff was just hidden, swept under the carpet? And that just reading stuff like this is just so interesting. It's fascinating, but it makes me want to go further back, just further back, further back. But you know, forgotten times, you have to dig deep. The further back you go, the harder it is. The harder it is. I'll read more next time.